Okay, sounds like it's on. Maybe a little loud. Probably not too hard to figure out. Today's lesson isn't what we would call a feel-good lesson. The scriptures often call us to deal with some difficult topics, and today is going to be one of those. I invite you to open your Bibles and open your minds. We start looking at a topic like the wrath of God. We have some very serious things to think about, and I appreciate Josh's pick of songs today. They fit in very well. There's going to be a day where there's a judgment of God. We talked about it in class, where all this is going to end, and at a point, we all stand before God. And it's going to be revealed to us. We will be judged by the things we do in the body. It's a day of judgment of the ungodly. 2 Peter 3:7 talks about how this earth is going to be destroyed. We talked about that in class this morning. So everything we see is going to be gone. This is temporary. There's more, and there's more important than what we see here. What's going to happen is God's righteous indignation. Put yourself, in a sense, in God's shoes. When you look at, He has created, He has made us. He has given us every good thing. And then, even though we rebelled against Him, He paid the ultimate price. We just remembered that we could be saved. And if we turn our back on Him, if we say it's not that important, if we go our own way, this is righteous indignation. He has every right to be furious at us. We tend to look at it as though this is all future. But when we look in Romans chapter 1, we start in verse 18. It talks about how God's wrath has already come. It said the wrath of God is revealed. That's a present tense from heaven. So we know He's already showed some things. How is it? What is it that stirs this up? It's against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by unrighteousness suppress the truth. So when we have those that are, you think God could be neutral to something, let us go our own way. There were times in the Old Testament where the writers where God would say, if you do this, I will fight against you. Not only will I not be there for your blessing, not only will I not be with you, you've made me your enemy. What He's saying here, this is against what they're doing there. This is a foretaste of His righteous indignation. How does He express that? And why? This is long before the day of judgment. And this text is going to talk about it. And it says it's because man stifles the revealed truth. By their unrighteousness, they suppress what is true. The way we act, we say we really don't want to hear it. We can't hardly have discussions anymore about something that says this is right versus wrong, because in a postmodern world, my right and your right can be two different things. That just doesn't really make common sense. We were talking at the end of class about what makes sense in philosophy, which is basically seeking to say, how do we get to a point logically? There is a truth. We justify what is ungodly and unrighteous. That's really what's driving this. Verses 19 and 20. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, namely His internal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. If you cannot look at the physical world, if you cannot look at the complexity of design and say, there has to be a designer, if you cannot look at man, who is made in the image of God, and say, he's not like the beast. There's something different here. If you cannot see the attributes of God in that, you're not being honest. That's really what he's saying there. You are choosing. You are choosing. So this is, they are without excuse. It is an interesting thing that some people will want to make the argument, if I just had some proof. That is so disingenuous. Answer what you're saying. How do we start? Where's our starting point? And the truth is, whether we look further out in the cosmos, or we look further into how life exists, the same thing comes. It's more complex than what people believe. When we were kids, the amoeba was supposed to be this simple single-celled thing that has hardly anything. The more we understand it now, it holds like a set of dictionaries full of information. It is complex. Do we choose to see God or not? And it's not something that modern science has to do. The psalmist saw it. The invisible attributes of God. I can't see God, but I can see his attributes all around me. So when man just turns his back on it, God has the right to be angry. He can be ungrateful. Verse 21, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened, even when they knew him. There's a method of thinking that says, I can reject just because I determined to. That's what the Jewish leaders did with Jesus. He showed them every proof. There's a method that rejects. And if you read books by evolutionists, there are some that will say, I can't prove my theory. And some, because they know I can't prove it, will turn to a higher being. But I'm not gonna. This isn't the school science books, by the way. This is written by the scientists themselves. They become futile in their thoughts. Where does that take us? If what's really happening there is people want to avoid having authority over them. Many people who are agnostic or atheist who come to faith will at a point say, the reason why I was resisting was because I didn't want to feel like I had to answer to God. I wanted to do what I wanted to do. That was the honesty in it. Where does that take man whenever he rejects God or rejects his authority? Comes up with his own God, however you want to do it. The psalmist, or the proverb writer says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It is fools that despise wisdom and instruction. So if I don't look at what God tells me, I can have my philosophy, you have your philosophy, you have your philosophy. What makes one better than the other? We can say we don't want to serve a non-existent God, we want to serve man, but in reality, it always devolves into it's about me. And in it's about me. No, it's about me. And that's where society goes. Our designer tells us things we don't have to experiment. We don't have to go there. We don't have to make those mistakes. So we don't glorify God. Verses 21 to 23. We don't acknowledge him. We don't say everything good come from him. We don't give thanks. Then we are going off on our own. We want to experiment. I've got my ideas. I'm going to try this. You have your ideas. We're going to try that. We see ourselves as wise. Maybe we can articulate ourselves very well. Well, that means I must be wise, or I have so many degrees. I'm a scientist. I must be wise. We should go this way. Really what happens with it is we become fools. Because we are rejecting true knowledge. And man doesn't have it within himself to have true knowledge. What man ends up doing, because God put eternity in his hearts, is he starts making up gods. And he looks out, and I will say, I am awed when I am outside, A-W-E-D. When I see the stars, when I see the heavens, and how grand this is, and creation is. But I don't want to bow down to the moon. That's what Israelites did. What about creatures? You remember when the Israelites were in Egypt, and God says, I'm going to get me honor over their gods. And you look at some of the plagues. Remember the plague about their houses were filled with frogs? You know why that was? Because they worship frogs. Is that wise? What it does is it leads to an idolatry. When Israel was in idolatry, they were drawn to it partly because they could write their own book. They were not restricted. They could do what they wanted. They could live like heathens. Modern man has his own idols. Secular humanism, where we worship ourselves. We could fall into covetousness. Life is all about things. What can we acquire? How many toys can we have? Notice that covetousness, that desire, that want to get more things is an idolatry. We wouldn't normally think of it that way from a human standpoint, but that's what God sees it as. All these things that are going to be destroyed, if that's where our focus is, that becomes our idol. So a man ceases to be thankful to God and esteems the created things over him, then this God who gives us all good things and pay the ultimate price so that we can be with him forever has this righteous indignation. There will be a last day, in that fiery end that we talked about. It's going to come like a thief. And everything we have, and all these things that we may want to acquire, all these things that we're looking at and saying, this is what life is all about. It can be power, it can be our careers. There's so many things that we can look at and get sidetracked on. It is going to go away. But looking at now, how does God manifest his wrath? And I want you to think for just a moment. We can have an annoyance. We can have a displeasure. We can have a I'm upset. We can have an anger. What do you think of when you think of the word wrath? It should hit us between the eyes. God to be that angry at me. God to be that upset with me that he would term it as wrath. Verse 24. He gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. He's not saying, what he's saying there is there was no fire come down from heaven here. But you know what? I called to you, and you don't want to listen, so I'm going to leave you to your own desires. There's a price for that. You want to live foolish, then you will see why I gave you a better way. To the immorality, to the uncleanness, in the lust of their hearts, wherever their wicked hearts led them. Jesus talked about that in Mark. If you just leave it to man himself, evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness, all these things come from within a man. You leave a man to himself. So everything that's good and right, and they're dishonoring their own bodies. Why? Because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. We don't want to hear it. And man doesn't want to hear it. God's not going to make him hear it. It reminds me of when the Israelites said, we want a king. And Samuel said, they rejected me. And God said, no, they're rejecting me. They can have their king, but there's a price to pay for it. If that's what you want. I think that's what God is doing here. Is this really what you want? I'm trying to get you to a better way. I'm trying to save you from problems here. I'm trying to save you for eternity. I'm trying to be able to bless you. Is this really what you want? I'll leave you to it. Worshiping and serving what is created. Man always worships something, whether or not he admits to it. Makes his own deities, follows his own desires. So, God, again, gives them up. Verse 26. He gave them up. Just leave him to his vile passions. So he gives a case in point. For their women, exchange natural relations for what is contrary to nature. We're talking about lesbianism here. This is a sign of what they're doing. I don't want to hear what God says. I don't want to hear the wisdom of God's design. What ends up with this? Body's designed not for this use. Case in point, men and women are designed to help meet each other's needs. When someone says, I'm going to go into the same-sex relationship, what they have is an imbalance. They're not designed that way. And what they end up with is they lose out. They don't have the needs met emotionally. They don't have needs met all around because they're going against design. God says, I'm going to leave it up to that. He gives another case in point because men do the same thing. It ends up the same kind of situation. They don't get their needs. There's an imbalance there. And I want to go into details because that's not the full extent of this, but I want to understand that woman was designed as man's companion for a reason. And she was designed psychologically as well as physically to be his companion for a reason. And the use of the woman is so that for marriage and for that together. And we look at Romans 1:27, and we finish that verse. It says, "And receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error." Without the gory details, let's just say it is a very unhealthy way to live. We'll leave it at that. Yet again, God gives them up to a debased mind to do what what do you want? Do what you want to do. There's different ways people reject God, by the way. They can say, God doesn't see, God doesn't really pay attention, it isn't all that important to him. However they look at it, however they reject God, he says, I'm going to give you up to your debased mind. There is a price. If that's really what you want, that's what you can have. So the result of it is that man keeps getting worse and worse. I want you to see a progression here, or I could call it a regression. Once one man turns his back on God, he's going to get worse and worse and worse. Notice that. They degrade. When our lives degrade, what God gives us is for our good. What he tells me to behave like is for the good of my children and my grandchildren, for the good of my wife, for the good of my brethren, and for the good of society around me. And if we break that down, all of those start to degrade. Do not miss the progression of evil there. Notice how that they are filled with all of these evil things. The kind of things that cause a problem. Are these the kind of people you want to have as your neighbors? Are these the kind of people you want as your co-workers or those around you? Is that the kind of person you want to be? This is the end result of it as they grow worse. Underpinning that, the thought process that God had whenever he gave the Israelites the law. He says, this is how you're going to live. I'm giving you knowledge. And the end result of that, if you listen to what I say, is that other people are going to look at you and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. They're doing things different than anybody else is doing. And you know what? It just works. They're not experimenting. But they have a certain standard they live by, and look how well their society works. People were experimenting socially. Man had his philosophies and his ideas, and it ends up in unrestrained evil. Continuing in our text, and I know I'm hitting this rather fast. I want us to understand the overview and put an application to it for us today. They understand God's righteous decree. And what they've taken is the I don't want to hear it attitude. They know that is deserving of death because that is what God gives us. Not only do they practice them, but they back each other up in it. They approve of it. There are people that will say, well, I wouldn't do that, but, they should have the right to. It isn't just, if we think of the thought process here, it isn't just saying, I don't want to do that, but the willingness to say, you know what, you should be able to do whatever you want to do. There's a price to pay for that. I want you to understand that this is not theoretical, even by the New Testament time. There was something that happened here in Genesis chapter 15 when God is talking to Abram, and he's talking about where your generations are going to go. And he talks about them going into a land where they were going to be abused. Basically, it was Egypt. They're going to be slaves. And at a point in time, they're going to come out, and they're going to take over this land. Why is that? Because the people in that land, their iniquity is not complete yet. And if I understand this right, what's happening here is God, who's not by time, is looking and saying, their society is degrading because they're not listening to me. It's going to go to the point where I'm going to have to deal with it. I think it's a parallel to the passage we read in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 36, where God kept sending to Israel, and they kept rejecting until he said, until there was no remedy. They refuse. I can't fix it because they refuse. I think that's what's happening here. I want you to consider these principles. Rejecting God, trying to come up with our own way. It degrades the individual. It degrades the family. It degrades society. And they keep getting worse and worse. I want you to think about that when we look at the topics and some applications to this, because evil people go from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived, lying to others and being willing to take the lie from others. What I want to believe, you tell me that, I'm willing to take because it boosts what I want to believe. There's a lot of things happening. I have the way to search for what God gives me, but I'm rejecting it. Can we see that? That's both those that are deceiving and those that are being deceived. I want to make clear that this is not about politics. I want to talk about America today. It is about sin. That's the word we're not supposed to use anymore, right? We don't want to talk about God in public anymore. Religion has no place in the public discourse. Some are blatant about it, and some are not as blatant. But this is scary. It scares me to say people want to think like this. When abortion started as a national law, I was young, but enough that I understood something about it. It started out with the promise that these are just a bunch of cells, and they're not really human, and we promise we will never, ever, ever do anything to a pregnancy when what's in the womb looks even remotely like a child. Just a bunch of... This is a before and after picture of birth, by the way. This is a sonogram. What is the difference? What is the difference? How does God look at it? Is that a person or not? Then they said, you know what, there's some situations where we need to look at the second trimester, and there's some situations where we need to look at the third trimester. We're right now, when a baby is being born, if the mother decides she doesn't want that child, we're killing the child. Do you see how evil is going from bad to worse? They never would have sold this at the beginning, but people start taking it a bite at a time. And now it's been proposed, because we can't immediately find birth defects in all children, we should consider allowing up to 2 years old. The word abort, by the way, is abort the pregnancy, because they're avoiding saying, we're killing a child. And the arguments are things like, it's important to have it available because of rape and incest. But really, that's not what drives it. That is such a small amount of, even if you wanted to try to justify it, which we can't, the cases are so few. It's really about convenience. It is about trying to have a society where we don't have a consequence for our actions and our sin. Let me point out that what is has been. In the Greek society, even endorsed by the philosophers, the great philosophers who still color Western thinking to this day, if a child was born with a defect, they believed, let the child die of exposure. Or take the child up on a mountain and toss him off. And it might not be because there's really a problem. It might be because, that's a daughter and I wanted a son. The Germanic peoples would never think of doing that to their children. And they were looked at as barbaric by the enlightened. Let me ask you something. Is this not America today? You are backward if your thought process says we must save the children, or this is a child. Ever since it became the national law, it validated in people's minds that it is okay. The government has endorsed it. Before it was state by state. In the book, What the Nurse Saw, Eyewitness to Abortion, Nurse Brenda Pratt Schaefer got a job because she needed the money. And she always considered herself pro-choice. And then she went in and she saw what they were doing. And in a short time, they were knocking on the bathroom door saying, hey, where are you? We got more procedures to do. We need you. She's in there throwing her guts up because she saw the reality. That's hidden from us so that it seems okay. Probably the best. I'm going to say this first. With the gruesomeness of it, there are a lot of people who don't know what this is. And I've known Christians who are new Christians who wept openly and said, we didn't know. Probably the best known at this point in time is a lady named Abby Johnson who made the movie Unplanned. She formerly ran a Planned Parenthood, and she tells the truth behind the lies. It's about making money, and they talk about women's health care. It's about abortion. It's a grist mill. That's what it is. Ever since it became a national law, over 61.5 million killed. The Holocaust was less than 1/10 of that. It has its own museum. So make sure this doesn't happen again. This is America today. We are a nation with blood on our hands. What about what we're dealing with, and this is the last topic I wanted to touch on, and that is the homosexuality and the transgender thing that's happening in our society today. Some absolutely scary things that I've had to stand outside of a bathroom in a public place to make sure somebody didn't go in that wasn't supposed to be in there when my wife was in. And, you know, I'll be in the same situation with my grandkids, I'm sure. What is, has been. Most know of Sodom in Genesis chapter 19, and that is way back there in Abram's day, where God destroys the city and the plains with burning sulfur. Killed everybody there. You knew better, you wouldn't do it, and they were very evil people. Leviticus chapter 18 is a chapter where God is explaining to the Israelites what sexual immorality is in excruciating detail. Things that I won't go into in detail with children here, but let's put it this way. When you hit the New Testament and God says, don't be involved in sexual immorality, you know exactly what he means because he tells you in this chapter what it is. Every kind of perversion you think of. And what he said, and this is clear back then before they took the land over, and he says, the nations there have done these things. That's why the land is vomiting them out. They have been that evil. So, how is it posed to us today? It was, some of these things were a prison offense whenever I was a child. It was considered a psychological problem. People crafted and worked on getting that out of the psychology books. It's not really a problem. Then it was an in-your-face thing. Now we coin words and concepts, and English speakers, we're good at coining words. Any kind of concept we want to sell, we coin a word for. Let me illustrate this for you. Some of them in the young people's class have seen this. But if I said the word caveman, what comes to your mind? Some kind of a half-ape being that never existed. But you've heard the term so often that it sets in your mind. God made man fully formed, made him in his own image. This never existed, but the lie told often enough, long enough. Now you think of terms that are being used today like homophobic, an irrational fear. So if you say this is sin, you have an irrational fear. You're being irrational, you're way off the edge there. People say things like, I was born this way, or God made me this way. And they say it often enough, people say, well how were they born? You know what we were born? We were born male and female. That's it. We start coining terms like gay marriage. God made marriage. God made man and woman. Made woman for man. He designed them for each other. He instituted marriage. He defined it, and we can't redefine it. And I would argue that if we say the term gay marriage, it's a misnomer. It is a contradiction in terms. God designed marriage so that men and women can help fill each other's needs and give stability and create the home, which is the best place for children to grow up in. And it's the bedrock of society. Okay? What we're seeing in our society today is happening largely because of the breakdown of the family. We can take the minuscule cases of some, very, very rare cases where a child is born that has both sets of equipment, we could say, and what we want to do is take that and say, this is kind of, this is so natural, and we want to confuse kids at a time when they're already confused in life. And we try to sell these ideas. We're going to pay a price physically as well, by the way, with this. Remember how evil progresses or regresses. the idea behind gay marriage isn't that we want to be equal. It is that we want to be accepted. And if you research into it, and I have, and if you want to read more about it, I can give you some materials that was very well done on it. Some activists say we want to destroy the family. We want to destroy marriage. And in places where it becomes the law, there are some that will go, and they'll say, we'll go through the ceremony because we can. Then they have this abominably high divorce rate. That's not what it's about. What it's about is if we can get the government to say, this is normal, then I can do what I want to do, and you'll look at me as normal. That's really what's driving behind this. Don't be fooled by it. They're encouraging experimentation among the young. And as is chosen, we get more people involved in it, then we get that going. California has now starting down the path of allowing the abuse of children. And they're posing it the same as everyone. If you say this is wrong, you're an extremist. And they're trying to shut up people that would say, don't do this, by calling them extremists. I sent to my kids an argument on social media from it, and I said, no wonder it's termed the wrath of God. That's not where it's going to end, by the way. And it's happened elsewhere, next to animals. And all those things, Leviticus 18, know it's coming and be prepared. What happens is it's designed to shock and then progress in your mind to complacency, where we just ignore it, and then to embracing it. And I read what a lot of young people in schools and especially in colleges now are pushing this, terms like homophobic are so, it's part of their lingo now among the young people. They embrace it. We talked about this a little bit in Ephesians, where he said, be angry and do not sin. He didn't say if you become angry. He said, be angry. I'll tell you what, there's a righteous indignation we need to have when we see these things. Do not go there. You are not coming around my children, my grandchildren, with this kind of stuff. I will say this, when you're dealing with people, when you're trying to teach them, or discuss that some things they do does not give us a reason to abuse and to hate. The common thread is this. If you say don't do this, if you say this is sin, then you must hate. And that's what's really being pushed today. The idea is don't talk about it. I'm going to shut you up by calling you hateful. And we could fall into that because there are some sins that disgust us more than others. But when Paul talked to the Corinthians, and the church at Corinth was an idolatrous place where ritual fornication was part of the worship in the temples. And he talks to them and he says, and such were some of you. There is not an adult in this building today that doesn't have a hope of heaven outside of Jesus Christ. And we can't be high and mighty to people and say, some of us have dark pasts. I didn't do that, though. How do we get... These people need the gospel, too. That's my point. They need the gospel, too. And we need to approach it that way. I would say if you want to understand hatred, it is letting God down whenever He makes us a watchman. You have the word. You warn them. The principle of the watchman. I have told you. You tell the wicked of his ways. Now, it's up to him. The ball's in his court at that point. And I will say, Jesus paid the price for his sins as well as mine, or her sins as well as mine. And we need to warn. In conclusion, if these sins are in your past, you can be forgiven. If they are not, if they're in your present, then you need to repent and be forgiven. Anyone who comes to God on his terms, anyone, God will forgive. Have you become complacent? This isn't about politics. This is about sin. I'm not saying get involved in a political movement. I'm saying stand in the breach. I'm saying be that watchman that warns. And this is for all of us. I forgot I put that on the same slide. I always mess that up somewhere. I really like the New King James in 2 Corinthians 5:11 because it says, therefore we knowing the terror of the Lord. And it's within the context of saying we will all stand in judgment. This is the call for us today. Stand in the breach. Warn them. Persuade them. Let's have the right attitude. Let's have the right heart. When Jesus talked to the woman at the well of Samaria, she was a woman that surely lived with men. And she still got this call to repentance. This is what you need to do in your life. Last thought, in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel is this young man who had shown faith, who was beloved of God. He is in captivity. He's never going home. And he comes to an understanding of the sins of his nation, and in chapter 9, he prays for the nation. Pray for our nation. Stand in the breach. Warn them. I hope this has been useful to you. More than willing to discuss these things in more depth with any questions you have. If there's anything we can do for you as a group, we encourage you to come forward as we stand and sing.